It is the final countdown to the midterms, and both parties are bringing out their heavy hitters during the final stretch. President Trump scheduled 11 rallies for the week leading up to Election Day. He included stops right up until the night before November 6th. On Monday, the president will campaign in Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri. And on the other side of the aisle, former President Obama is also appearing on the campaign trail. Last week, he said there's no excuse for not voting, urging supporters to make their voices heard at the ballot box.
So if you don't like what's going on right now, don't complain, don't get anxious, don't throw up your hands in despair, don't boo, don't hashtag, vote.
I'm joined now by Leslie Sanchez. She's a Republican strategist and CBS News contributor, and Joel Payne. He's a Democratic strategist and CBSN political contributor. Welcome to you both. Leslie, I want to start with you. We saw President Trump hold a rally in Montana Saturday. He talked about immigration, including this caravan of Central American migrants, which is still weeks away from the U.S. Let's listen to some of that.
The Democrats only believe in defending the borders of foreign countries. They don't want to defend our border, but of foreign countries, that's fine. And we're straightening that whole mess out, too. It's happening fast. Republicans believe we must defend our borders. We have to defend the borders of our country, and that country is a country that we love, the United States of America.
So, Leslie, that's just one example of the president not at all backing away from this issue of immigration. In fact, sort of doubling down on his rhetoric on that topic. How confident are Republicans that that is a strategy that will work on Election Day?
It has very mixed results. If you go back probably the last 15 years, candidates that ran on a very hardliner type of just border enforcement approach basically lost in their primaries. And it's completely different now. They win in the primary if you take a Trump stance, and you were always defeated. And it just reminds me of like John McCain, the late John McCain's presidential campaign, where in his campaign office, on one side you had this inclusive message of like secure the border but have comprehensive reform, and on the other side were more hardliners in the fundraising office who were saying no, John McCain will not be the deciding vote on comprehensive reform. Just this morning you heard the RNC chairwoman talking about comprehensive reform. So I think there's so many mixed messages from the Republican Party on what that means, and right now it's just used as a talking point to galvanize these late voters expected to turn on Tuesday.
So, Joel, let me ask you about Democrats, because the message we seem to have been hearing from a lot of them is healthcare, healthcare, healthcare. So how confident are Democrats that focusing on that message is going to work for them?
I think Democrats feel good. Listen, one thing you have to say, whether you like or dislike President Trump, he creates clarity. And while Republicans certainly feel like that is good for them in terms of galvanizing their base, I can tell you a lot of Democrats in places, not just like the West Virginias and the Indianas, but in places like Florida, in places like Georgia, where Democratic turnout is surging, where people for the early vote are feeling very good about the numbers, that clarity is creating energy on the Democratic side as well. So I think Democrats feel good. I think Democrats have done a good job of not getting lured too deep into President Trump's trap. It's obvious he wants to turn this into a cultural war. He wants to talk about immigration. He wants to talk about things that's going to stir up his base. Democrats have done a good job of pivoting back to the issues that we know impact voters. Health care, the entitlement issues, things like that that are going to move voters on Election Day. Democrats are focused there.
It's really interesting that these are economic issues, whatever side of the coin you're on, whether you're talking about immigration or whether you're talking about health care. It's speaking to that soft Democrat that's not necessarily engaged to vote in a midterm election. And it's so much so because it reminds me of Hillary Clinton when she was talking about driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants when she was just running her Senate campaign. And Republicans saw an opportunity there. So we've been laying this strategy out in terms of what works on immigration for almost 2 decades. What the Republicans will be for border enforcement, closing that border, doing something from a national security perspective, and the Democrats are the open borders, let them in, take our jobs from an economic perspective. And that line is even more clear, I think, to
well,
Joel's
that's
point
that's what the
today.
president will want you to think. I'd say there's a little more nuance than that.
No, but just from a black and white perspective
No, I
of who
understand.
you're
I
trying to
understand.
vote,
Right.
trying to get to vote that Rust Belt state, forget the mountainous West that's much more ethnically diverse, but talking about this Rust Belt area that's really up for play now and in 2020.
So let me ask you though, Leslie, it's fascinating to watch when the president hits the campaign trail. He does talk about immigration, and kind of that is obviously one of his central themes and central messages. At the same time, it can often feel like he brings up most everything else, and I imagine, for people who are watching or listening, there's a lot to take in there. What do you think regarding that? I mean, is that particularly helpful? Is that an example perhaps of just trying to throw it all out there, and for those voters who may not particularly feel moved about immigration, that perhaps there may be something else there that might stick?
Well, to your point, it's like the president is looking for his applause line.
Yes.
Like, oh, they're staying,
Right.
and he talks about that. He's reading the crowd. When I say lock her up, we get the applause lines. When I say, Mexico will pay for the border, I get the wall, I get the applause line. And he said it just this week when I'm talking about immigration. You stop seeing people filtering out of his rallies. The president is looking for that quick hit, that immediate response with no ramification, no thinking about the consequences of those words.
And what about on the other side, Joel? You have President Obama going out there, in a way that obviously we hadn't seen him before.
Sure.
This is the last minute push here. How confident are Democrats that he will be able to mobilize the base and at the same time not spur the other side and sort of energize them in the way that perhaps President Trump does for Democrats?
That's an interesting question you pose about President Obama mobilizing the base, because we saw in the last two elections that President Obama was a factor but was not on the ballot. That did not work out for Democrats, and so that still remains a challenge. I would argue, by the way, it remains a challenge for President Trump. This is his first opportunity to be both a factor but not on the ballot. Can you really get people to say, you know what, I'm not voting for Ron DeSantis, I'm voting for Donald Trump.
Right.
I'm not voting for Dean Heller, I'm voting for Donald Trump. Do people really think that? In the same way for Democrats. Hey, a vote for Andrew Gillum is a vote for the values of Barack Obama. Will voters accept that, and will voters engage on those terms? We'll see within the next 48 hours, I guess.
He raises a great point because and it's so different because the president wants to to nationalize this election, and most presidents don't. Their report card, their 2-year report card tends not to, we're a work in progress.
Right,
President doesn't
right.
care. He's kind of heading into that wind. And the difference is the candidates in this primary, the candidates that are doing well are the little mini stereotypes. They're exactly lock and key with the president because the old establishment Republicans, the kind of more moderate leaning, especially on issues like immigration, are nowhere to be found. There's certainly crickets on that side.
I was telling Leslie earlier in the room, from a Democratic standpoint, there's two Republican parties that are emerging. There's the party of Trump, and then there's this moderate kind of post-Trump battle for the soul of the Republican Party, the Charlie Bakers, the Larry Hogans, the John Kasichs, people like that.
What happens to them?
What happens to those folks? Do they feel embraced by this big tent? Because I'd argue those folks coming home are the reason why Donald Trump won. Will that happen again this cycle? We'll see.
And it's fascinating though, Leslie, because this seems to be such a sense of political self-awareness on the part of this president that in fact he understands how it is that, as someone once put it to me, he is like oxygen. He is everywhere and understands that full well, and yet, as you note, doesn't shy away from that. In fact, tries to use that for political benefit. This is not like a president that we've seen before.
We'd have to ask a historian, a
Yes,
true historian.
right.
I have some knowledge, but not like that. I would not be, one of my.
But he doesn't
my
seem to be worried that he's going to necessarily be somebody that is going to kind of upset those who might be on the fence. He doesn't seem to be concerned with that at all.
Not at all. There's a very specific base of individuals he's speaking to who are frustrated with Washington's politics as usual, are looking for a change. They like the sharp elbow. They want this type of president. And what's interesting is you've seen Republicans who were just, arguing that this was not the approach. It was going to damage what the true Republican Party was, have basically gone silent because the president wins elections. The question, Elaine, after this and leading to 2020 is at what cost? What does this mean for young voters who are growing up in a generation where race and identity politics are all they talk about? Are we reliving the 60s and some of the most hurtful, painful times in this country? And what does it mean in terms of identity when you have more individuals who are not picking a Republican or Democratic Party, but again, we're moving like the 70s into split ticket, crossover voters. So the landscape is changing ethnically, demographically, and culturally.
Joel, when you look at the latest numbers, things look positive for Democrats' chances of retaking the House. How confident, though, are they actually? Because, there was a level of confidence in 2016, and we saw what happened for Democrats there, right? I don't have to tell you, Joel Payne.
With you.
That's right. That's right. As opposed to in some administration office somewhere. But, so there is this question about whether or not that confidence might perhaps be premature.
So living as a political campaign staffer, you run scared. This is the time when you're running scared, when you're figuring out, oh my gosh, did we spend enough money in Wisconsin? Did we spend enough money in Michigan? Are we on air enough points in this market or that market? Right. So anybody, regardless, Republican, Democrat, you're panicked now to figure out, have I covered all my bases? And so I bet you there are a lot of people in races all across the country who are thinking about that right now. In terms of Democrats, I think Democrats do feel good, particularly about the House. The president's been smart about kind of reconfiguring the math here. He's not going to be judged now on losing the House. I think he's going to be partially judged on how do I do in the Senate, and also how do I set up my arguments for 2020. I actually think that's really what the president's doing. We know he looks at everything through the lens of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And through the lens of Donald Trump, what matters most is not what happens in 3 days, but what happens in 2 years, in 2020. And I think he's starting to set up those arguments as well.
So last question for both of you. Oftentimes when we look at things from the national perspective, there were things we can miss, right, at the local level. It was fascinating talking to Shauna Thomas from Vice about the fact that in California's 25th, gas taxes are a huge issue. How much more local do you get than that, right? I'm wondering, let me start with you, Leslie, what do you think it is that we are perhaps not seeing that we should be focusing a little bit more on as we head into Election Day at the more local level?
What's interesting, if you look, for example, at Southern Florida, where you have Carlos Cobello and you have the former seat belonging to Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and he worked for, the congressman worked for Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. And there's this whole kind of transformation of the next generation of Cuban American, of the next generation of a very emboldened, strongly connected, community organizing type of candidate that knows their district and constituency, and they're both in very strong battlegrounds, but they don't fit the traditional Republican Party. They're kind of defining their own through Florida, Miami, particular politics. And I think that's where we get to the Vice example, that politics is local. Texas is another example. You have all these young, energized voters, but are they just one-time, kind of one-off, this is a really exciting Senate campaign with Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz, or is this somebody that's really learning how to engage in the political process? So I think we're seeding new ground, Elaine. That's what I think the story is. Young voters, people that don't traditionally vote, how are they really gestating in all of this? And we won't know for another couple cycles.
I'm thinking about governor's races, right? So when you look at not just the high profile ones like Florida and Georgia, but let's look at South Dakota. Let's look at Iowa. And not just for Democrats just to be able to hang, have another feather in their cap, but also when we think about redistricting, which, by the way, Democrats got boat raced on for the last decade, and they see an opportunity now to make up ground in terms of redistricting, in terms of having that influence over those very important processes that don't always make front page news. I think Democrats are really, really focused on that for the first time in a while, and we'll see if in those kind of second-tier governor's races, how those play out and how those impact the electorate and the type of turnout that we're expecting.
I just want to that 2000 and 2010 were key for the Republican Party strategically, governor's races, because of redistricting. We are laser focused. That is one thing I can say about the Republican Party, because that we realize state legislatures, that's where all of this is happening. And I don't think that we ever take the eye off the ball.
So much at stake. Leslie Sanchez and Joel Payne. I will bring the Red Bull on Tuesday. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.